Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our Eating Disorder Hope webinar presentation here. I'm joined with Maggie Geraci, who is the Director of Nutrition Services at Timberline Knolls Residential Treatment Center. And we're so excited to delve into our topic tonight that I think a lot of people who are in recovery can really appreciate. But before we get started, I just want to point out a couple things if you're watching tonight. You will have the opportunity to submit questions to Maggie tonight, and you can do that by posting them in the question pane of your control panel. So feel free to submit questions at any time during the presentation. And once we get through with our interview with Maggie, we'll then proceed into a Q&A period where we might read your question live to Maggie. So please feel free to submit your questions during our presentation. So let's go ahead and get started. And tonight, Maggie, we're talking about how to practice intuitive eating during the holidays. You know, it's crazy. I can't even believe we're talking about the holidays coming up so quickly. You know, Thanksgiving is right around the corner. But before we start talking about that, I just want to ask you a little bit about yourself, kind of your role, your current role with TK and your background working with eating disorders.
Thanks for the introduction. I'm excited to be here tonight and talk about something so pertinent and, like you said, quickly approaching as the holidays. So I am, as you said, the Director of Nutrition Services at Timberline Knolls. I'm a registered dietitian. I oversee the dietitians and the dietary technicians, so I kind of oversee that meal plans are carried out, that all of the residents are met with, that any protocols that need to be developed are developed. We work on developing nutrition groups that are more pertinent to, the ever-evolving world of eating disorders.
Mm-hmm.
I, organize education for the dietitians and then provide supervision for the dietitians and the diet techs. So it's kind of a lot of moving pieces, but each day is different, and that's why I love TK. And, working with eating disorders in general, it's just each eating disorder is different, each resident is different. So you have to constantly be on your toes and challenging yourself, and that part of it I definitely really enjoy. But at TK we talk about, our premise is health at every size and intuitive eating and mindful eating. So all of this kind of really played into what we preach at TK.
Absolutely. And, we just so appreciate you taking the time to be with us tonight. I know you're really busy and you have a lot going on, so thank you so much. So let's delve into our topic here. And for our viewers who are watching or joining us tonight, not everyone is totally familiar with what intuitive eating is. So can you start us off with maybe just describing, what intuitive eating is, how someone eats intuitively, things like that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think the best way to explain intuitive eating overall is kind of just returning to your childhood form of eating, going back to eating when you're hungry, stopping when you're full, which I know sounds very obvious, but the action of actually carrying that out is a lot more challenging, than most of us think, and especially those of us with eating disorders. And we find that, when you have an eating disorder, oftentimes your mind becomes clouded by all these diets. So, really bringing it back to that intuitive state and recreating that healthy relationship with food, mind, and body.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a real challenge to work on distinguishing your physical hunger, your emotional hunger, and knowing that, your worth as a person is not dictated by the food that you're eating and if it's good or bad food per se. So all of those things kind of go into it, but there are actual principles of the intuitive eating, and this is actually a group that we go over at TK with the residents. We talk about each principle in length and then ask them, what that means to them, and oftentimes we're met with a lot of opposition and, I can't live that out. And so that's kind of something we kind of process through with the residents. But I can go over each of the principles, and then if people have questions to ask, in more detail, I can certainly do more of that as well.
Sure, that'd be great.
Okay, yeah. So the first one is just rejecting the diet mentality. So really just getting rid of this culture of what we should omit and what we should eat and all of that. That's kind of, it's forever changing as well with fad diets and, fat is bad, carbohydrates are bad. So how do people keep things straight? I mean, the answer is to just not follow all these insane diets. So really, first and foremost, rejecting that mentality and knowing that, the longer that you follow the diet mentality, the more it's going to make you feel like a failure when it doesn't work. And inevitably, diets long term won't work.
Right.
Um, so that's kind of the first one. And then the second one would be honoring your hunger. So, trying to understand more so when you're biologically hungry, and it's going to look different for every person. So, a lot of times in my first session with residents, I'll go over, does your stomach grumble? Do you feel lightheaded first? Like, what are the signs of hunger? Because it will look different from person to person, and a lot of people don't realize that. So,
Right.
really honoring that hunger and then fulfilling that hunger because we know that the alternative when you don't satisfy those feelings of hunger is for, oftentimes for a trigger to overeat, as that is kind of our primal drive to eat when we're hungry. So why not satisfy it when it's absolutely needed? And this will overall kind of just improve your trust with yourself and your food and all of that. And as I'll probably say multiple times, consistency is key, and just, eating consistently throughout the day is going to help you long term with honoring both your hunger and your fullness. So we definitely want to honor the hunger. A good way to identify your hunger and fullness is to use a hunger fullness scale. So a scale of 0 to 10. There are lots of them out there, but at each number on the scale, you can identify a different, either physical feeling, so that you can more readily identify where you're at. And that's kind of a good question to ask yourself, kind of like at the beginning of a meal and halfway through a meal and towards the end of a meal.
Yeah.
Then the next principle would be making peace with food. So this is the conversation I just had today with a resident, just calling a truce, like giving up. I was asking her, like, what would it feel like to not think about food 24/7? What would that feel like? And a lot of times, in the beginning, they can't fathom it, but the concept of it, the principle of it is a good way, especially to go through holidays and things like that, but just giving up, calling a truce, letting it go for, even a couple of meals, giving yourself that unconditional permission to eat what you'd like in the moment. And knowing that, the more fear foods that you do have, the smaller your food world becomes, and the easier that these behaviors become to act on. And so just really trying to just give up, make peace with food in the moment.
Mm.
And with that, the next principle kind of leads me into the next one, which is challenging the food police. So, whoever the food police is to you, whether it be yourself or maybe a parent, maybe a diet book, recommendations you're following from somewhere, just challenge that and kind of chase away the food police in a sense, and know that the ultimate goal is for a brownie to have the same emotional charge as an apple, and we want a fair playing field, and all these food police, if you will, are just hindering your ability to appreciate life in and of itself, but especially holidays and things like that where food is a big part of it.
Yeah.
And then kind of on the opposite note of honoring your hunger, we also want to respect your fullness, of course. So, I talked briefly about the hunger fullness scale, and that's a good way to determine your fullness. But another way to kind of slow down during a meal and determine your fullness would be to think about all of your senses while you're eating the meal. So, how it smells, how it tastes, the texture of the food, really enjoy that food. And ask yourself where you're, when you're kind of starting to reach your satiety, just continue to check in with yourself through the meal. And remember that in the beginning of recovery, you might have to do some mechanical eating for months, even a year, to kind of reset those hunger fullness cues. But, eventually the end goal is to be able to follow these principles and respect your fullness. But again, I want to reiterate that in the beginning of recovery, following your meal plan is going to be key. And then discovering that satisfaction factor. So knowing that, so say I was just at a restaurant today that had all the calories listed on the menu. So say you're at a restaurant like that and your decision is between a couple of foods, and if it's a calorically driven decision, you're probably not going to enjoy the food as much as you would have had you just gone with what you really wanted. So, discovering what you really like and that might be an entirely new process to figure out. But allowing yourself that satisfaction, and you might decide that you really loved that meal, and you felt that you were honoring your fullness at 75%, or but you won't know that until you choose the foods that really are satisfying to you.
Hmm.
The next principle would be honor your feelings without using food. So find ways that you can, cope with your feelings without using food whatsoever. And on a holiday, that might be a hard day to do it. But we will talk about some alternatives to that. But knowing, always constantly reminding yourself that food is just a momentary fix. It's not a long-term fix. So, and you're likely going to feel that shame or guilt after acting on a behavior. So really trying to use some of your alternative coping skills in the moment on a day like that.
Mm-hmm.
Then we have respect your body. So accepting that every body is going to look different, and you can kind of incorporate haze or health at every size at this point, and know that it's going to be really hard to reject the diet mentality if you're not accepting your body where it's at. So, accepting all of the principles with it. And then the next principle is exercising and kind of just feeling the difference. So this comes from a standpoint of exercising to, not for the goal of weight loss, but for pure enjoyment, or, we know that exercise has health benefits and can have positive effects. So if you're at a point in your recovery where you're ready to exercise, incorporating appropriate amounts and consulting your team to find out what is appropriate, if the meal plan has to be increased and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last principle is just about kind of honoring your health overall and honoring your taste buds. So kind of what I was saying with the satisfaction. So enjoying the food that you eat, participating in the meals that are holidays, and knowing that each meal is a new opportunity. So, if this meal doesn't go well, or it's a really triggering or challenging situation, that's totally understandable. But the next meal is a totally new opportunity to, reinstate that relationship with food, and know that one meal is not going to make you gain 10 pounds. It's also not going to make you deficient in whatever nutrients or vitamins or minerals. So each meal is a new opportunity. Those are the principles.
Yeah, thank you for that nice little nutshell of intuitive eating. And, it's exactly like you said. I think it seems very simple on the surface, and it is, but when you've been through an eating disorder, I think all your sense of what is normal about food is completely lost. And so intuitive eating is hard to learn and to regain those natural signals, and not only be able to tune into them, but to respond to them appropriately. So thank you. Those principles are so key and so foundational to what intuitive eating is. I appreciate you explaining that.
Mm-hmm.
And I also just wanted to say, one thing that I thought was really important that you mentioned was that not everyone who is in recovery can necessarily be expected to eat intuitively, especially right off the bat. When you've had an eating disorder like anorexia or bulimia, you really can't trust your body, and you can't be expected to listen to your body until you've been through recovery for, a significant point of time. So I appreciate you touching on that as well. So let's talk about the holidays. There's always so much surrounding the food and the meal itself, and that's often the center focus point of the holidays, like Thanksgiving, Christmas. So what do you think are some of the struggles that a person might face during a holiday that makes intuitive eating, more difficult?
Absolutely. So we always have the typical stressors, right? So family, I don't know how your holidays are, but maybe arguments may arise on holidays. If you're hosting an event, so we always have those stressors. And then of course we have this huge added stressor of, the focus of typical holidays is food. And then on top of that, a lot of, whoever in your family may or may not know about the eating disorder may encourage you to eat more or less, dependent on the eating disorder. So we have all that kind of playing into it. In addition to, often with eating disorders, as you all well know, we see co-occurring. So, there may or may not be alcohol involved, and if substance abuse is an issue. And then, you always have historical expectations. So, last year I wasn't active in my eating disorder, so Christmas looked like this, and this year it's going to look different. So there's all those things playing into the holidays themselves. So, and I'll go on to kind of talk about different ways that we can approach holidays with all those things playing into it. But just remember, to not set expectations too high just because the main focus of holidays is food in and of itself, and that happens to be the biggest struggle that that person is working on.
And such so many good points. And I think too another big thing that you kind of touched on was like the comments. I think oftentimes, with holidays, you're seeing relatives that you haven't seen forever, and people just comment about your body and how you look, or they'll say like off the wall things like, "Oh, you look so thin, you lost so much weight," or like that's such a common occurrence in holiday family gatherings, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Um, and we all know, I think those of us in the eating disorder community understand that our body is not a reflection of how our actual health is. Like you could be overweight, you could be underweight, but that doesn't reflect how your health is as a person. Like health at every size, like you're saying.
Yeah.
Um,
Another thing that's often brought up around, a holiday table would be diets and things like that too. So I think that's where it's so important that, if you are working with an outpatient team to work with a family therapist, or, if there's any opportunity for family education on what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, those are really important things to put into place before the holiday begins.
Definitely. And I think too, like if that happens where you're already like offset by a triggering comment, to kind of find some way or somehow to like regain focus. Because I think comments like that just really make people shut down internally. It's like, oh my gosh, I look like this. I'm not going to eat anything, or I'm just going to let it go and eat everything, like those extremes. So I think that's a big thing that a lot of people commonly deal with, at least in my experience.
Absolutely.
Um, but yeah, thank you for touching on that. I think that's really helpful. I think it's helpful to understand ahead of time of what those triggers might be, so you better know how to face them.
Mhm.
So what are some steps that can be taken to support intuitive eating during the holidays?
Yeah, so absolutely. The biggest thing is prepare, prepare, prepare as much as you can. So, whether it be with your treatment team or with yourself, there's a couple of things that I think are really important. One being just kind of writing down your vision for the day. So, what you intend for it to look like, what you'd like for it to look like, and then maybe after even writing what actually happened, so you have an opportunity to kind of reflect on what that day looked like, how it turned out, and knowing that, things are going to change. It's a fluid environment and it's a holiday. So, levels of happiness or intensity are already kind of elevated as is. So, really just writing down your vision. And it might even be something good to bring with you to refer back to, like in a quiet moment off by yourself if you're having a challenge. And then before you go to the holiday, you want to kind of find out all the details. So what's going to be served, when it's going to be served, where it's going to be served, kind of what the setting's going to look like, and then try to kind of think of how you can meet your meal plan ahead of time so that, again, those stressors are taken out of the way. Might be good to identify, again, going back to the family, talking to the family before, but it might also be good to identify a family member that you trust that can help you kind of either, I've had people where they're like, I'm just not ready, and then they'll actually have a family member portion the plate for them, and that's the stage that they're at. And then I've had people who, just maybe have someone to look out for them if anything comes up that they might want to redirect in the moment. So whatever it may be. Or there's even been people, we want to do our best to try to make it speakable in the moment if you are feeling an urge or anything coming on. But I've even had people that have, exited the room if something does arise, and then had a good person to call in that moment to kind of talk it through.
Mm,
So again, depending on the stage of your recovery, it might look different ways, but the biggest thing you can do across the board is be prepared, and also maybe even role play with your treatment team or your dietitian how to be assertive when someone does bring up a comment that you're not ready for, just as simple as, why aren't you eating more? Why aren't you eating less? Bless you.
thank you.
Um, And yeah, that role play thing can be a huge help.
Yeah, I like
Um,
that question.
yeah. And then I think listing, along with kind of your vision for the day, some people find are more, task and goal oriented. So it might be helpful to just list personal goals or relationship goals for the day. And then again, some
Mm-hmm.
people find it helpful to keep it on them to refer back to.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that might be helpful is even like preparing, I know it sounds silly, but preparing topics to talk about. Like if,
Yeah.
in the moment they're feeling that anxiety is high, just kind of what they can talk about unrelated to food.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and just remembering overall that, whatever point you're at in your recovery, you may not be at a point where you have the luxury to just have one large meal for the day like some people do on Thanksgiving.
Right.
It may just be best to, again, kind of keep that consistency throughout the day, keep on your meal plan. And remembering everyone's meal plan looks different. So everyone around the table is going to have completely different needs and completely different plates. And, that's how it always is because we all have different bodies. So, keeping that in mind that your plate might not look the same and even your day might not look the same just because of the place that you're at.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's kind of the majority.
Yeah, those were all really great suggestions. I think one of the challenges about holidays, and you can fill in what you think too, Maggie, is I think there's that mentality like there's going to be this big meal with all these like foods that I don't normally eat. And a lot of people come into holiday meals thinking, well, I'm just not going to eat all day and then I'm just going to like let loose for this big meal and just, go to town. But for someone in recovery, like that's such a dangerous mindset, and I think it increases urges to re-engage in the eating disorder behaviors when that physical hunger is there. If you're not honoring hunger throughout the day and then all of a sudden, like, you're presented with all this food in one sitting, I think that becomes really overwhelming. So I like how you touched on that, that you need to keep eating throughout the day like you would normally. Like, just because it's a special meal doesn't mean you can starve yourself all day.
Right. And in the same token, you can have a little bit more of the things that you really love on that day.
Sure.
But yeah, consistency is again going to be key. And, because then oftentimes that'll lead to kind of that black or white thinking like, oh, well, this meal or this day I messed up or I engaged in a behavior and then, it might be more challenging to get back on track the next day. So we want to, just keep it consistent as much as possible.
Absolutely, and really try to fight that black and white mindset that I think, someone with an eating disorder naturally falls into. So let's talk about when things don't go as planned. And that happens, that's just reality that sometimes triggers come up or things become overwhelming and hard to manage. So, if intuitive eating efforts haven't gone as planned during the holiday season, or even during like one meal in particular, what are your thoughts? How might you encourage someone in that kind of situation?
Yeah, well, I think as always, remembering each meal is a new opportunity. Um, Focus on to prevent that from happening, kind of focusing on decreasing outside stress that's not needed, So if we already know the holidays are challenging because grandma's always nagging you about school or whatever it may be, trying to minimize that or planning ahead for that and how you're going to react to that. So those things can always be helpful, but I think a big thing, is radically accepting, in the moment that like, I had this whole thing planned out and, it didn't work out exactly how I intended. And that's how life is. And, I have the flexibility to understand that things arise and, I did what I could in the moment and the next meal is a new meal. Tomorrow's a new day. It's all a learning experience. And then again, if you do set your vision before, then you have that opportunity to look back on how you can make it look different next time. And even maybe potentially, making some new family traditions. Maybe, this year for Thanksgiving, you guys go bowling and then just have a standard meal after bowling because, again, that's where you're at in recovery and that's okay too. So just looking at it, just kind of changing your perception of how the day or the meal went is probably going to be the most helpful.
Yeah, I think those are such great suggestions. And I think too, for holidays that are so hyper focused on food, sometimes it's nice having something planned like after the meal, like something you can do together with your family or just to kind of help distract. I think distraction can be a really helpful coping mechanism during the holidays when there's so much going on. But yeah, I love your suggestions. I think those are really great.
Absolutely.
Um, and, I think too that you just hit it right on the head when you said, like, it's not just about this one meal. Like, every day is a new day. And I think if you've been in that moment and you feel like you've just utterly failed and messed up, it's important to know that if this is not the end, you can try again. There's always tomorrow, and one meal does not make or break your recovery. And I think it's important to keep that perspective when things feel super overwhelming.
Yeah, absolutely. And just kind of when those ED thoughts are so strong, challenging it with kind of your wise mind thoughts, and doing that maybe after the meal or the following day, just to kind of get you back on track.
Yeah, thanks so much for that insight, Maggie. And just final question to kind of wrap up the interview portion of our webinar for this evening. What encouragement might you offer to someone who is in recovery from an eating disorder and, approaching this holiday season?
Yeah, so overall, I mean, obviously all the things that we've already kind of spoken about and touched on, but I think remembering what the holidays are about, remembering that it's kind of more so about the size of your heart than the size of your body, and, focusing on, family and food, but it doesn't have to overpower the other, and just kind of body neutrality, and that kind of acknowledging what's going on as opposed to what you're longing for. So, acknowledging that you're appreciating enjoying the food that's nourishing you as opposed to wanting a different body type. Or, I mean, the same goes for the holiday season itself, right? Acknowledging and appreciating the people that are around you, whoever that may be, as opposed to longing for more of X, Y, or Z. So, just kind of bringing it back to what the holidays are about. Having your plan in place and knowing that you might have to readily accept that things might change that plan, but knowing that you have that fluidity and just appreciating what you do have.
So well said. Thank you for sharing that insight. And I think that's something really great to keep in mind as we approach this holiday season very rapidly. So that kind of concludes our interview portion. So thank you, Maggie, for taking the time to share your insight with us. And we're now going to open it up for a Q&A period. So just as a reminder to our attendees who are currently listening, if you'd like to submit a question, feel free to do so in the questions pane of your control panel, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. So Maggie, we do have a few questions that I'll just read out loud, and we can kind of discuss. So let me look through these here. Okay, so our first question comes from Ashley, and she's asking, for clients that don't want all family members to know about the ED, what would you suggest would be helpful to prepare the client and family members for the holiday meal and assertiveness in conversation?
Okay, so if they've chosen a select few that they do want to know about the ED, obviously I would have that conversation and education around what that's going to look like. And then those that they don't want to be informed of, I think that I would just ensure that they do choose one family member that they feel comfortable with that could kind of redirect the conversation or redirect anything that does come up in the moment, so that it still won't dive into the wrong route. It won't go towards diet talk. It won't go towards anything that would potentially be harmful for the client. But they still won't have to inform 30 plus family members of what's going on.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for answering that. We have some other questions here. Let's see. We have a question from Leah, who's expressing that she's struggling a lot with meeting her meal plan that is set by our dietitian. which is, and it looks like it's intended for weight restoration. Um, so she's kind of asking, how do you know when you can start eating intuitively when you're on like a weight restoration type of meal plan? And I
Yeah.
know that that can be really difficult when you feel like, Leah, let us know if we're kind of getting your question right, but it sounds like it's hard for you to eat when you're not feeling hungry, and often that's the case when you're on a weight restoration type of meal plan. You might have that early satiety and not feel like eating all the things and all the requirements that you need. So, any suggestions or feedback on that, Maggie?
Yeah, and without knowing Leah's exact route or how far along she is or how long her restoration process is going to look like, I can kind of just give a general answer that it can certainly be challenging, especially if you're doing supplements or a bunch of extra intake just to get you to the point that we need you. But I think remembering that that's kind of your nutrition prescription and, it's not lifelong. It's just typically, a set period of time that we need to kind of, like I said, do some of that mechanical eating until we get to the point where we feel comfortable, like you can progress to the intuitive eating. So I can't really give, a set time frame, but just remembering that just like a prescription, it's like something your doctor would order, any depression meds or whatever it may be, and kind of use it as that until you can start to really enjoy food again, and some of those supplements or things like that might decrease at that point.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, and I would add a little bit to that too. That it's very difficult to trust what your body needs when you're still in that recovery phase from an eating disorder, and even though like physically you feel a certain way, the body that you might be in at that moment is still a result of the eating disorder itself. So it's really important to follow the guidelines of your professionals who are surrounding you. And as hard as it is to trust that, just remember they always have the best in mind for you. So I hope that helps you, Leah.
Absolutely.
Um, okay, we have a question from Sue, and she says, great information, thank you. Do you recommend any books for therapists new to learning about eating disorders? And Sue, I'm just wondering if you're asking about intuitive eating for therapists new to learning about eating disorders, and I don't know, Maggie, if you have any suggestions.
So I do have, I thought I read it. I have the intuitive eating book, of course, I would recommend. And this is for therapists in particular or for
I think
dietitians?
she's asking for a therapist, yeah.
Um, let's see. I know a lot of dietitian related books. I would say a really good one, The Diet Trap, kind of talks about ACT therapy and ways to, it talks about the diet trap. It talks about rejecting that mentality and really incorporating all foods fit and kind of aligning your values with the food that you're eating and all of that. That's something I would definitely recommend from a therapy standpoint. Do you have any suggestions?
Um, you know, I also would highly recommend the Intuitive Eating book by Elise Rusk, and then who's the co-author? The other author, I can't think of her name. But if you search for intuitive eating, that book will pop up. It's by two authors, and it's a phenomenal book. They're the ones that kind of started the movement foundation of intuitive eating, and the principles that Maggie described at the beginning of the webinar, they go into them in depth. And I know they have an audiobook and then the regular book, so I highly recommend checking that out if you're interested in learning more about intuitive eating, either as like a professional or, just for your own knowledge. It's a phenomenal book.
Yeah. And then any dietitians, the kind of rule of thumb book is The Nutrition Counseling in Treatment of Eating Disorders by Marsha Herron.
Mhm.
So that's a good one for dietitians out there too.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Let's see here. We have a question from Mallory, and she is asking, how do you know when you're ready to try intuitive eating, and how do you best plan for extra support around that without feeling like you're distracting people from the holiday?
Good question. Good question.
Yeah.
Um, so how do you know when you're ready to try intuitive eating is a really good question because it's it's kind of a fine line. I would say that the team, if you're working with a team, that would be the best place um, to refer to for that. But we often say following the meal plan for a year, and then you can kind of move into that intuitive eating realm. And then
Mhm.
how to plan best for support, I believe, was the second part of the question when you do start intuitive eating. I think is, you're going to want to hold yourself a little bit more accountable once you move into this realm. So, whether it be, I know I have a lot of clients that use like the recovery apps and things like that. Might be a good place to check in with yourself on, how you're feeling or if you feel like any of these urges are popping up once you've started intuitive eating.
Mhm.
So really holding yourself accountable, of course, maybe journaling how you're feeling, maybe relaying the information to your team. And then again, I think it is important to kind of have that point person. If there's someone you're comfortable with, letting them know what's going on, that and letting them know that you've moved to this phase, and you may have more urges coming up, and that you might need some more support in the moment.
Yeah, those are all great suggestions. Thank you, Maggie. And thanks for the question, Mallory.
Mhm.
Um, we have another question from Christy. She's asking, I've heard about a concept called a set weight, that each person has a weight that his or her body naturally settles on when he or she is healthy and honoring hunger fullness cues. Do you believe in this concept? And if so, how do you know when your body has reached it? It's a
Mhm.
great question.
Right. Yeah. So the set weight, yeah, we hear a lot about that. I don't particularly encourage that, and I think that, when we give someone a set weight per se, it kind of empowers the weight, and it kind of goes back to the obsession with numbers, and it can lead to, all of the, calorie counting and all that stuff. So I really don't ever encourage getting to an exact set weight because it just can be unrealistic. And oftentimes we see when people get to a set weight, then it's okay, so my set weight, for example, is 130. So then I'm here. Okay, now I'm moving my set weight to 125. And it just continues down this spiral of unrealistic expectations. Um, we know that there's certainly a usual body weight, a span of maybe 10 to 15 pounds where your body may or may not fall into typically. Um, and I think, dietitians certainly take that into account when making the meal plans and developing calorie needs and all of that. But, giving someone a specific weight goal gives that number on the scale a lot of power.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with you. And from my own experience, I think it's more important to focus on behaviors that, I think someone who is really depriving themselves nutritionally and not where they should be, like health wise, I think there's a lot of symptoms that result from that. So, if, for example, if you're very obsessive about food and you think about food all the time, that's probably a good indicator that you're not getting enough to eat or you're not in the weight area that you should be. But I absolutely agree with you, Maggie. I think it's not about a set number per se. I think we naturally kind of tend to fall into like a range that we stay in when we are eating normally. So, if in your eating disorder you always stayed at a certain number because of your eating disorder behaviors, that's probably not where your body is meant to be, if that kind of makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So hopefully that helps with your question, Christy. Um, all right, let's see here. We have another question from a mom who's here with us tonight saying, my daughter came home from TK and she made a comment before coming home about how she is afraid about being home for the holidays or is about the coming holidays. We want to be supportive, but we are also hosting. How do we balance this? It's a great question.
Yeah. So, I think, kind of the steps I outlined, just prepare, prepare, prepare. So, making sure that, the daughter has set goals, maybe the family has even set goals, those are who are involved and know about the active behaviors and, just planning, how can we build her meal plan? And that if she came home from TK, she should have a copy of her meal plan and how to build exchanges. So you guys can even review that before, a couple days before the meal. I'm sure the menu's set. So building exactly how she can meet the meal plan. And then, as we both kind of talked about, maybe planning an activity, planning a non-food related activity, bowling, something like that, to kind of distract her if, think items do arise, but giving her that space to, whatever her coping skills are to, if she likes to refer back to goals or journal or whatever, right after the meal as well.
Yeah, those are great suggestions. And I like how you said kind of working with, you know, your daughter or whoever it might be to help them figure out, okay, what aspects of the meal fit into your meal plan if it's just overwhelming. And I think that is a big trigger for a lot of people in recovery is that there's so many different like dishes and foods and it's just it can become really overwhelming. And I think it's important to remember all foods fit, but maybe just kind of helping them see it and plan it out ahead of time, like, okay, this dish can help meet this exchange, or, and I think that kind of takes a little bit of the stress off of the moment of sitting there at the table with all this food and trying to like figure out, what to eat.
Exactly. Yeah. So planning that ahead of time while of course always remembering that, we want to decrease rigidity and, it doesn't have to be a tablespoon of X, Y, or Z,
Yeah,
um, we want to eyeball it and, be able to have some flexibility with the measurements and whatnot. But, an overall plan of intake before I think will just decrease anxiety all around.
definitely. So we have just a couple more questions here. Leah's asking, what advice would you have for me in those moments where my eating disorder is really in control? And, I could see this applying to the holiday meal in particular, like sometimes those easy thoughts just pop up right away. And I think it feels sometimes difficult to overcome it when you're in the moment. So any thoughts on that, Maggie?
Yeah. Again, without knowing Leah personally and kind of what works best for her, um, I think a lot of my residents find it really helpful to just kind of in their heads go over the exact ED thought. So exactly what's showing up right now. And then challenge it. Like, where is this coming from? What is my meaningful life? What is this meal really about? Just so I would say kind of just have that conversation, just quickly kind of challenge those thoughts that are there. And then try to return to mindfulness and bring yourself back and continue to bring yourself back to what's sitting in front of you and the people that are around you and what's really important. So I think using some of those DBT skills and kind of, continuing to bring yourself back to what's around you.
Definitely. Yeah, and I think it's always good to have like an emergency lifeline, like something that you can do and kind of draw you, out of that situation, whether it's like texting someone or, whatever it is that you have that in your mind ahead of time, like if X, Y, and Z happens, I can do this and just be prepared. Like as Maggie said, I think that's so key when you're in recovery.
Yeah, and I think worst case scenario, like I said earlier, it's like kind of having a bit of an exit strategy where you can, take a step outside for a couple minutes, call someone and come back. As long as it's someone that you feel like is recovery focused and would be a good support system, that's always an option too.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much, Maggie, for taking the time to answer those questions, and thank you to our attendees for. Oh, we just got one more question, if you don't mind
Sure.
answering. It's actually from Sarah, wondering if you have any suggestions to deal with eating disorders in a geriatric population. And I think maybe that's a little bit off of our topic tonight. So if you have any thoughts, Maggie, otherwise, Sarah, if you want to send a follow-up email to us at info@eatingdisorderhope.com, and we can definitely connect you with some resources for that. But did you have any off thoughts on that, Maggie?
Yeah, I mean, you can certainly send that email, and I'd be happy to follow up with more resources, since it's not exactly what we're talking about. But I think, a lot of times with geriatrics, it might be a textural issue. It might be, there might be different comorbidities that play a role that not that aren't as prevalent in a younger population. So I think working to identify, some of the differences and addressing those first probably would be most helpful. And then, you obviously you'll have to kind of change your treatment style a little bit to match that population. Um, but the same premise, I mean, intuitive eating kind of helps wherever you're at. Um, and, the same mindful eating skills could certainly be helpful.
Yeah, I like that. And I think that's really important to understand, whether you yourself are the one dealing with an eating disorder or a loved one. We understand that eating disorders affect people irrespective of age or gender or background. It can affect anyone. So I do love that about intuitive eating, that it's something that can apply to any person, regardless of where they are in their life. And if you're in recovery, it's something that you can ultimately be working towards. So, yeah, a lot of great questions. Thank you again to all our attendees for joining us tonight and for submitting your questions. And then, Maggie, just in closing, do you have any resources to share with our attendees who are interested in learning more about TK at Timberline Knolls?
Yeah, you can always access our website. And then I can even share my email if you have any further questions at mgeraci@Timberline Knolls. And I'm more than happy to, provide any information additionally.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you again for your time and for sharing with us. And for our attendees, again, we appreciate your time and being with us. You can check out eatingdisorderhope.com for more resources, and as well as the schedule of our upcoming webinars. So on that note, we wish all of you the best with the upcoming holiday season, and take good care. Thanks again, Maggie. Bye,
Thank you so much.
everyone.